Hello and welcome to the webinar on remote work and cybersecurity, supporting employees amid a pandemic. I am Eric Vanderburg and I'm joined by Bogdan Salamakha. He is a cybersecurity engineer at TCDI. Bogdan is an experienced cybersecurity professional who helps protect companies from cyber threats, comply with regulations, test security controls, and gain assurance in their information security. He serves as cybersecurity subject matter and penetration testing and conducts research in cybersecurity through reverse engineering of malware. In addition, Bogdan conducts evaluations of attackers' activities through systems designed to monitor controlled systems. We also have Frank Yako. He is a technology and business executive with over 30 years of experience in solving complex business problems with a unique blend of business, technical, and organizational change management skills on a global basis. His experience spans multiple industries, both internal and on a consulting basis, with a focus on healthcare, insurance, manufacturing, legal, and financial services for global mid-market enterprises as well as startups. Mr. Yako is currently CIO and Director of Strategic Initiatives at ASMGi, a global provider of technology solutions, and is a graduate of the University of Dayton in Dayton, Ohio, with a BS in Electrical Engineering, and Baldwin Wallace University with a Master of Business Administration. So in this presentation, we're going to talk through three main topics. First is remote work considerations, as we have so many people who are now working remotely in the pandemic. Wanted to consider, how does this affect the organization and how do we handle that? Next, what are some of the common cybersecurity attacks and strategies that we need to be aware of, especially when working from home and in supporting those remote workers? And lastly, how do we support the remote employees to maintain a secure and functional working environment so we can continue our business, continue offering our services and products and functioning as well as we can. So let's look at a few of these remote work considerations. Think about your company right now. How many people did you have remoted in before the pandemic? Well, we see some of the stats here. It's about 4.7 million people in the US worked remotely. Now, of course, we have a much greater number. You may have had some existing systems that you put in place to help employees connect to some of your resources remotely and perform some of their duties. But now, some companies are finding that those resources are far oversaturated, and they are having some difficulty in connecting all those remote workers so that they can perform the tasks. In some cases, these security systems need to support so many additional users and still provide the same level of due diligence and screening out, malicious connections. We've seen systems get overwhelmed and be unavailable to users. Prior to this, we had 90% of IT officials believing that remote work really was not secure. So that's definitely consideration, and 54% believe that remote workers are a greater risk than the on-site employees. Lastly, 93% have created remote work policies and procedures to help mitigate the risk. These are the standards and guidelines that are going to stipulate how that remote work is going to be performed. So as we think about all this, as the remote workers are connecting in, as we have different risks that they're going to face, we'd like to talk about some of those risks and some of those concerns that we'd have for the remote workers. Bogdan, would you tell us a little bit about some of these common cybersecurity attacks and some of the strategies?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having us. And we want to welcome everyone from their living rooms and their bedrooms and their pajamas. I want to sound a bit of a broken record right now as I talk about some of the common attacks, but hopefully we can lighten the situation by talking about some strategies and some techniques we can implement to, lessen the burden on our IT and on our security infrastructure. Really, the first one is phishing. I think many of us have already heard enough about phishing and the potential risks when it comes to phishing. However, in today's time, in terms of what's going on right now in the world, I think phishing is going to become a much greater threat because people are already sort of in a panic or maybe even experiencing some disinformation or confusion with the rapid changes to the way their business normally functions. So instead of going to the office, being surrounded by your other coworkers, you're now working from a home in a more relaxed environment. You may not be as vigilant now when it comes to reviewing your email or, reviewing your links or email attachments. As we know, phishing is still one of the greatest risks to an organization outside of, employees in and of themselves and limited training. But phishing, from our experience, has been the greatest risk to a business, and it typically leads to much greater compromise for things like ransomware and virus attacks and credential harvesting and credential stealing. However, one of the things that we can do to protect ourselves from phishing is to, just be more vigilant. Avoid clicking on links that don't look familiar to you. Don't open attachments from emails that don't look familiar to you. Always double check with your coworkers, your superiors. If you weren't expecting a link or an attachment, or for them to ask you to process some sort of payment, always pick up the phone, make a call, send a text, validate that what you're getting is legitimate and accurate. Of course, we also recently we've been recommending that people don't necessarily send attachments, don't send Word documents or PowerPoints and emails. Instead, have a centralized location in, whether it's in your data center via VPN, or if it's in the cloud in like OneDrive or Google Drive through G Suite Business. Have a centralized location for all your file storage, and just reference those files within your email to point, the appropriate person to the correct file in a secured cloud storage location. One of the questions that came in during registration for this, remote work webinar was whether there are, risks of sharing computer viruses as organizations begin joining more communication services such as Slack, Microsoft Teams, and many of the other ones that are being released out there. And from our experience as security experts, we want to say that the risks are significantly higher, because we've seen the use of Office 365, OneNote, and OneDrive as means of sending malicious links to potential victims. And essentially, the malicious attackers are using trusted infrastructure, the trusted Microsoft Office 365 infrastructure, to bypass email filters and spam filters. And then once the potential victim gets that email, they click on the link, they're redirected to a legitimate OneDrive and OneNote websites. But once they're in there, they're then redirected to, a email and password harvesting site or other malicious sites that may download malware. We understand that BECs and business email compromise is typically the goal for most phishing attacks. They don't necessarily want to just infect your machine anymore. A lot of malicious attackers are now looking for ways of, gaining some sort of monetary benefit from phishing. So, in the last year or two, the FBI has received more than 351,000 reported scams with losses exceeding $2.7 billion. So this phishing is definitely not something to balk at. It's a very serious threat, and I think it should be taken very seriously. Like I mentioned, phishing usually always leads to a much greater threat to an organization. It doesn't stop at credential harvesting. It doesn't stop at even acquiring PI or personally identifiable information of an individual. It typically leads to a greater attack, such as ransomware or other backdoor attacks that can provide a malicious attacker group or an individual with the ability to exfiltrate data and then sell that data either on the black market or sell that data back to you by saying, hey, pay me $250,000 or you're not going to get your data back. And there's no way to decrypt it. And if you don't have backups, you may be out of luck. And with ransomware and a lot of this stuff, it's very scary, but I know most organizations are already taking many steps and preventing these types of attacks. First, obviously, is be wary of phishing emails. I know that may be a little bit vague, but just like I mentioned in the beginning, be vigilant. Don't just click on links, don't immediately open attachments, but take appropriate action in communicating with your coworkers actively on a phone call, or if you have Microsoft Teams or some sort of method of synchronous or asynchronous communication that you can immediately give feedback as yes, that was me, or no, that wasn't me, don't open it. And then I think we're going to throw it back to Frank here, and Frank will talk about one of the biggest reasons why a phishing can turn into something greater, and that has to do with something that many of us have done as we were logging into this webinar, and that is click that little button that said, hey, I don't want to install Windows updates right now. I'll do that 2 weeks from now when I'm forced to. Delaying Windows updates, delaying patches will typically lead to a greater attack. And Frank, if you wanted to go into some of this in more detail.
Great, thanks, Bogdan. So as Bogdan mentioned, one of the things that is usually set aside during these types of times is the requirement to keep both applications and operating systems and the supporting infrastructure up to date. So as it's noted on the slide, 60% of the data breaches involve some type of vulnerability that are unapplied patches that are typically known and just have not been applied to an application infrastructure or some of the operating environment that each of us rely on. So that's something that as we deal with the realities of the pandemic, it's something that's extremely important to not set those activities aside and to keep on the regular schedule that may have been established for performing those types of activities. And whether that's the services that as external service provider are providing for your environment or internal IT, it's extremely important to maintain those schedules, recognizing that the remote workers may create some type of different schedule for performing those types of activities. That's something that's also important, is to look at whether there has to be any adjustments to the timing of applying patches and doing those types of maintenance activities, but at no point in time should those be stopped due to the circumstances that we're all living through right now. So it's important to make sure that those things are being done, and that that also includes both services that you might receive from external service providers as well, such as software as a service applications or hosted applications, as well as the environment that we all support and maintain as part of the infrastructure and applications that support the business. In addition to that, we have the requirement for BYOD devices, and that's something that many organizations may or may not have policies for. And we have the situation now where there's devices that are being used that are not corporate issued, and that also may need to have some type of updates done so that we can be assured that the data that's being accessed or your applications that are being accessed are actually on devices that don't have known vulnerabilities as well. So if you don't have a policy that references the use of unpatched devices or keeping updates up manually or automatically updated, that's something that's important to reiterate with your team members to make sure that they are not bypassing those updates either out of convenience or just have shut those down and are not following the due diligence required. There's also, in some environments, the ability to do a check of those devices before they're logged on to your applications or infrastructure. If you have the ability to do that, then that's something that is definitely encouraged to enable those types of capabilities. There might be some upfront work to either do that or support devices that are not allowed to access your environment, but it's well worth the effort to go through and actually do that so that you don't induce any types of problems within your environment. In addition to that, and specific to BYOD devices, we highly recommend that you have some type of toolkit for remediating issues. Again, recognizing that those might not be corporate devices, or even if they are corporate devices, if there is some type of malware that is installed or as a payload through someone clicking a link, make sure you have the tools available to help to remediate those, so that ultimately you're not in a situation where that's causing outages or any type of ransomware, as Bogdan mentioned previously. And then now we'll transition to data that's not been encrypted or is not on devices that have encryption enabled. So, as noted on the slide, 46% of employees admit to transferring data between either work devices or potentially even personal accounts, and that's absolutely something that should not happen. If employees understood the regulations that exist or the contractual commitments that your organization has made with your clients, they would understand that that is in no way, shape, or form acceptable and something that should be done. A lot of times that's done out of convenience, and is something that we don't recommend is done at any point in time, because as we know, there may be instances where those personal devices are not encrypted, data is left out in the wild, and there's a chance that if something happens to that device, it could very easily, that information is available to be compromised and not protected to the extent that you would if it was on your applications or internal devices. So ideally, what you can do in that scenario is to, as much as possible, use company devices that you've established the criteria for working remotely. They've been encrypted. They have the ability to use things like VPNs and are secure. If you have to use a personal device, then that's where the ability to make sure that all patching is done. If it is possible to encrypt those devices, to do that. And then at no point in time should any type of data be stored on those devices. Ideally, if you are using some type of file sharing solution internally, then that should be the means for accessing that data, using your applications to work with that data, such as Word or something, or Excel, but then making sure that that data is not stored on that local device. And then last but not least is, if you have applications that don't have timeouts on them or log offs, this is the time to make sure that those are enabled as well. And then make sure that if someone is working at home, they don't leave their devices unattended, especially locking those if you're in a public area or that type of scenario as well. In addition to that, and again, we'll reiterate a lot of policies as part of this conversation, but there's also a scenario where you have lost or stolen devices, whether those are personal devices or some type of company or corporate issue devices. If you have a scenario where someone loses a laptop or any type of device, it's important to make sure that there is some type of lockout on that device, so that if it is stolen or lost, it's not unprotected and easily accessed by the person that might have stole it or found that. So things like having two-factor authentication enabled helps to prevent easy access to that device or applications that might be accessible through that device. As I mentioned, having the lockout functions on there and requiring that. And again, if that's a BYOD device, sometimes it's difficult to enforce that, and that's where having a policy to enforce that, or at least to make sure everyone's aware of those requirements, then it's important to have that also covered. In addition, again, this is sometimes a path of convenience is to have the logons written down or saving applications using some type of personal password manager. If there's any way to avoid that, then that's definitely important to make sure that at any point in time credentials are not saved unsecurely or ultimately even shared between individuals out of convenience. So again, these are things that are best practices overall, but especially in the times that we're talking about now are extremely important. All right. So I'm going to transition, and we'll talk about company issued devices and some of the practices around there.
I'll jump in here to cover Wi-Fi. I know, many of us are going to be at the comfort of our couch in the living room with their laptop connected to our local Wi-Fi. Really, many of us may not have the risk of using public Wi-Fi at a time like this. Many public locations are closed, at least like coffee shops and cafes where majority or at least 62% of security incidents happen for remote workers and people who like to work out of the office. However, we still have the recommendation of, generally avoid using public Wi-Fi or even unsecured Wi-Fi. Very often, even in my personal experience, doing my own reconnaissance, I've seen that a lot of unsecured Wi-Fi networks exist even in neighborhoods for unknown reasons, whether they're guests, just unsecured guests, and, there's nothing malicious about it, but I still wouldn't trust it, and in today's day and age with the advancement of technology, it is fairly simple to an extent to spoof Wi-Fi networks and force a unsuspecting user to connect into a malicious wireless network. So there are some things that we can do to, protect ourselves in that aspect, and that is, one, make sure that you're keeping your Wi-Fi secured using a strong password. You're keeping your hardware updated in terms of firmware and software. So, update your wireless router firmware, which typically can be done through the wireless administration panel using a one-click thing, and then it'll reboot the router and you're good to go. Change your Wi-Fi names to something, maybe not directly identifying your home to an extent. There's, I've seen wireless networks that in neighborhoods that use their home address as their Wi-Fi name. So now I know exactly where that Wi-Fi is, and if I know who lives there, and I know what kind of cars they drive, and I know when they're there and when they're not there, that's not for me at least, but someone with malicious intent can look at that and say that, hey, I could possibly gain something from this. You want to make sure that your wireless networks are encrypted using WPA2 and AES, which seems to be the common standard now for many wireless networks. We also, encourage, home users to enable the firewall on the router. Typically, it's disabled by default just for compatibility, and most people want to just plug and play and get their Wi-Fi working as quickly as possible. The firewall may take a little bit of configuration in terms of, say you have like a TV that auto connects to your Wi-Fi, or you have an Alexa or Google Echo, or Google Home, or some sort of IoT device. Those may take a little bit of configuration, but I think in the long run, it's very, very worth it. You want to disable features like WPS, which allows a wireless device to connect to your Wi-Fi network using a 6 to 9 digit PIN number. That can actually be very easily cracked using publicly available tools, and it provides literally no security layers to your wireless network, and it's more a convenience thing, as well as UPnP features, which typically are there for things like television, smart televisions, and smart IoT devices that can directly connect to your wireless network without much configuration. And they can take advantage of the router as they see fit in order to function correctly. And it's convenient, but it's not necessarily secure. Overall, I think generally with Wi-Fi, you want to also make sure that you're just using a strong password. In today's time, it's most people don't realize that for maybe $30 in a couple hours, I can rent space in the cloud and use very, very powerful machines to crack passwords. 9-digit, 13-digit character passwords that to the human eye appear very strong can be cracked with $14 out of my pocket and maybe 2 hours of time using Amazon cloud compute infrastructure or the Microsoft Azure cloud compute infrastructure. So we definitely want to take precautions with Wi-Fi. It's not the perfect technology in terms of security, but there are definitely steps we can take into making sure that we are doing our best effort in securing those. Next, we'll cover the topic of supporting remote employees. Recently, there's been a great influx of remote employees, generally in terms of what's going on. I've heard some statistics and news of comparisons of the amount of remote employees compared to 6 months ago and compared to the date of this webinar, and it's a drastic percentage. So, Eric, if you wanted to jump into the next slide here and cover this.
Sure. Yeah, let's talk about supporting these remote employees. The first part, we've talked about some of the threats, but BYOD was mentioned many times. This, bring your own device, using personal devices to perform company activities. And while that may be convenient, it does present some risks. And so, when possible, certainly recommend having company issued devices for those remote employees. This gives you more control over the device. Obviously, having a homogeneous work environment that's separated out from the personal activities you may perform. And each one of those personal pieces of software or tools or games, is another opportunity that an attacker could potentially exploit. So we keep that stripped down to just the things that you need for work on that workplace device. That certainly reduces the attack surface and opportunities for the attacker. Also, we want to look at the encryption. And so, yes, you can implement encryption on a personal device, but issuing a corporate device will allow you to implement enterprise level encryption, which is going to include key material that's on the local machine and also key material that's going to be on the network, which means that you as a corporation have more control over the encryption on that device. You're able to take some things that the attacker would try to use to decrypt the device and separate those from the machine itself so that it's much harder for that machine to be decrypted. And you have more assurance that the data that's on there is going to be secure. Also, you want to be able to decrypt that data if necessary, even if the, let's say the user is unavailable, and this is needed for litigation purposes or for compliance or but determination or something like that. With the corporate devices, you still maintain that control and can still decrypt it if necessary, even without the user having to participate in that. So that's an important consideration. Second, we want to look at the method of connecting in remotely. And the main thing here is that we want to have an encrypted channel. So we focus on encrypting the data when it's at rest. We focus on encrypting the data when it's in transit. And we want to also secure those credentials that are used to access the systems. So as we implement a method for connecting in remotely, you've heard the terms VPN, a virtual private network. That is certainly a good method to implement. And this term has been used in multiple different ways. So I do want to draw a distinction between a VPN that's used for connecting into corporate resources and a VPN that's used for just securing your normal internet traffic. There are lots of free VPNs out there that are used to try to secure your internet surfing from others that might be in the same locale. Those end up going through some VPN provider's system, and then they're put out onto the internet. That's not what we're talking about here when connecting into corporate resources. This is a VPN that's set up by your company, and that VPN establishes an encrypted connection between your company's network and your local machine. So when you initiate that VPN, now you can connect in through it. It's encrypted, and any resources you access are going to be over that encrypted connection. And so somebody sitting in between you and the company would not be able to read that communication. So that's very important for securing the communications between those two sites. Now we see this other part here, remote desktop protocol. It's a protocol from Microsoft used for connecting into Windows machines. Now, by default, that's not encrypted. So but there are secure implementations of this. Some companies opt to use remote desktop protocol over the VPN. That's a great solution. There are also more gateway solutions where there's an encrypted connection that comes into a gateway device that then initiates a remote desktop connection to machines in the back end. Whatever way you're going to utilize, you want to ensure that you are encrypting that data and you're encrypting the authentication, meaning that username and password. If you encrypt all the data but not that part, well, then somebody can still steal those credentials and log in as you. And that's the last thing we want. So we're looking at the encryption on both of those. And then we want to talk about how are we going to share our files securely. And so Frank, would you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. We've talked about the methods for protecting the transport, such as the VPNs, encryption on devices, but then ultimately, most applications require some type of use of data to leverage that, and certainly there's the file level data, whether that's a Word document, a spreadsheet, or other types of data that's moved throughout the organization. So one of the things that we encourage or strongly encourage is that there's some type of either file sharing solution, such as a cloud-based solution, like a OneDrive, like a Box, Dropbox, Drive from Google, and that is the method for exchanging files versus emailing them. And again, as Bogdan mentioned, those can be compromised, but there's a high probability that if you're using that and that's part of your corporate standard, that users are used to using those, and that is a more secure method for doing file exchange than sending something via email, and then if you are sending it via email, there is that option of sending an encrypted email, which users may or may not be used to using, especially if they're either exchanging information within the organization, or if there's anything that contains any type of confidential or personally identifiable information, and that's being communicated externally, then that should be done via an encrypted email. And that's where there may be some training or refreshing of the users on how to use those types of capabilities. Also, we talked about the phishing, types of campaigns. Another option for ensuring someone does not fall victim to some type of phishing email or spam is to set up some type of alerts, within your applications, especially email tools that allow for notification of users if something is suspected. So whether that's a flag on an email that indicates it's from an external entity, or just having a higher level of security to prevent those types of campaigns from impacting your organization. The other is to go through and reiterate again the policies. I know we keep mentioning that, but because of the change in work patterns, it's important to make sure that users are familiar with those best practices that may or may not have been applied within the organization, but definitely deserve to be refreshed. The other couple of points there is that we talked about this, is to not use personal email as a means of convenience for moving information amongst either users or from the same person to themselves. And then under no circumstances should anyone ever use texting to send any type of credentials or information as well. So that's a little different than file sharing, but it's just still information that may be necessary to have that user work. And then, we've also mentioned other collaboration types of channels, such as Slack, Teams, or social media. Those should not be used for collaborating, especially when they're public spaces, again, as a means of convenience for moving information amongst users or between, someone themselves as well. So that's extremely important to avoid that. And next, we'll talk about IT support and the different demands that are being placed on IT support. And that really, as it mentions on the slide, is referring to both, internal corporate IT support, as well as if you are using any type of managed service provider. This is the time to revalidate, the support requirements with remote workers. There's obviously no desk side assistance that's going to be possible. It's all via remote connections to those devices. So if you do not have that type of ability to do remote support, that would be something to validate whether that's an option or you could implement that. Also, as far as coverage hours go, with the changing demographics and locations for users, there might be either time zone differences or different work schedules that need to be accommodated, and it's important to verify those with your service provider, whether that's internal or external, to make sure that those coverage plans and support plans are aligned to your business needs. And then also with the changing work from home plan or requirements, there may be alternating shifts or different coverage schedules because of some of the demands that are being placed on the remote work solutions. So maybe there is some staggered shifts or different coverage requirements that are going to be occurring, and that your support model needs to be able to be aligned to that as well. And then the last point there is as far as identification of both support individuals as well as users when calling for assistance. Common practices for someone to call in, have credentials reset, and then go and use those credentials because someone has not been validated as an actual user. If you do not have a method for having some type of response challenge type of scenario, or identifying someone to make sure that they are who they are, that's something that, again, could be very easily done and implemented. And then the last point is revalidate your service levels and to look at how your service levels are aligned to the demands of the remote workforce. So, there might be scenarios where you have different levels of responsiveness for solutions or technology that supports the remote workforce that might require a different SLA or service level and response time than other components within your technology environment. And that's something that's important to re-verify those and align those to this different work pattern and time as well. Next, we'll talk about the requirements for training. And again, we've reiterated numerous times about policies and procedures. This is an opportunity to identify the top items that are impacted or required to be understood as part of this shift to the remote work type of mode of operation. So having some type of regular reminders and training on such things as not the use of bring your own device, not transferring things via public means, having technology or antivirus on BYOD devices, the methods for contacting support. It's important to have some type of regular cadence for this type of information and to remind everyone that is supporting your organization that there are going to be users calling that might not be familiar with these types of requirements, and having a method for reinforcing those types of policies. In addition to that, there's things like the reminders of what is a campaign look like for doing phishing, and resensitizing everyone to that, so that that again your organization is not having to deal with those types of issues in the midst of everything else that's going on. Also, providing everyone with the methods for escalating support via the telephone or via any type of medium that you make available, since there won't be that option for desk side assistance. And then last but not least, if there was some type of incident or issue that's occurring, make sure that they're familiar on how to escalate something and report that to your service desk, and then some type of method for communicating, both the status as well as what might be going on within the organization. So, those are all best practices under any circumstances, but because of the types of things that are going on right now, it's extremely important to make sure that we remind everyone of those types of items. So I'm going to transition it back over to Eric, who's going to talk about some of the written remote work policies and the details around those. Eric?
Thanks, Frank. So yes, the next element here is to have a written remote work policy. So if we have some expectations, we have to, of course, get those written down, put them into an official document, and then communicate that document company-wide. And some of these provisions are going to govern how employees will connect in, how they're going to work with different types of data, where they can work on that data, how that data can be transported, and how they're going to continue to protect their systems and the data wherever they're at. So some of this is going to require training as well to ensure that everyone understands that policy, that they have acknowledged the policy, and you want to document that acknowledgement as well. We see down here some of the common elements would be the requirement of a VPN or some encrypted connection into the company, require sensitive data to be encrypted, and to prohibit work-related data on personal devices. So this would be using your corporate device for work purposes. And then, we can't just do this once, train once, and then leave it, because as we know, people forget things, and we want to keep the importance of this top of mind. So ongoing training is a must to ensure that that people don't just lapse into the behaviors they're comfortable with, that they are still performing their secure activities when working remotely. And last thing on here might be the requirement to use a password manager. It's easy to try to save passwords or cache passwords in tools. We don't want to do that, but then we have to remember so many different passwords for all of these different systems. So a password manager can allow you to encrypt that data, the passwords themselves in this tool, and to be able to pull them out at ease when you need them, and still keep them secure and not cached within the system. So put all this into your policy, train, and ensure that your employees know how they can work remotely. That wraps up most of our discussion here, but we did have some questions that we wanted to go through, and so we're going to talk through some of those here as we move forward.
Sure. Some of these questions came in prior to, or I guess during the registration for this webinar. And Eric, I'll throw this one to you. You spoke about, VPNs and their importance. However, Eric, are there any VPN-specific risks that you would like to highlight that most people may not think about?
Yeah, well, the first would be, if you're using the VPN, don't cache those credentials on your machine. Don't, save the VPN credentials. Let's say you had your connection into the office, and you've saved the VPN connection on your desktop, as I've seen many people do. Now, if somebody else is using your computer, or you leave your computer unlocked, those, of course, are not good practices in themselves, okay? But we want multiple layers of security here. And if somebody were to use that computer and double click on that VPN icon, now suddenly they're connected into your office and they're acting as you. That's an important thing here. So to the company, it appears as if you just logged in, and so any actions that they do appear as actions that you did. They steal data, they delete data, they send out a bunch of emails on your behalf. All of those activities look like they came from you. So don't save the connection profile with your password in it. Another thing to be aware of is just the difference between those two VPNs, the VPN that's contained into corporate resources, and a VPN that's used to try to obscure your internet browsing from those around you. The one is connecting into a secure corporate network. The other one, the data that you send over that one is not necessarily secure, because you just don't know how much you trust the other end. You trust your company, but maybe not this or that VPN provider. So those are some considerations when using the VPN.
Right. And Frank, you can jump in at any moment if you'd like. I think another consideration with VPNs and their specific risks is that, some people may be under the impression that a VPN will protect them from things like viruses and malware and phishing. And that's not necessarily true. A VPN is designed to encrypt the data in transit over the wire and provide you with, a virtual private network access into your corporate environment, so you can access your files, your print services, your internal intranet web applications, and the like. But you still need to be vigilant with clicking links and emails, opening up tabs, browsing websites, and just keeping an eye on ensuring that you're only browsing to sites that are encrypted, that have the HTTPS in the URL.
Yeah, I totally agree, Bogdan.
Yep.
That was one of the things that there is a difference between what the transporter or that connectivity versus what the user is able to do, and those aren't mutually exclusive as far as the excluding the potential an email is going to get through whether you're connected to a VPN or not. If you click on a link, whether you're connected via VPN or not, that has some type of payload associated with it, that's still going to create a problem. So users need to be extremely vigilant, especially in now our day and time, that they're very suspect of anything they receive unless it's from a known entity. And even then, they should not respond, as you mentioned earlier, to some type of request that does not seem normal, so that they don't fall victim to some type of scam or phishing attempt.
Absolutely. And we'll try to get a couple more questions in here. Frank, this one's to you. You'll probably have some good insight for this, but we had a question come in that said, should an employer verify and conduct an audit of an employee's home systems to ensure they meet the proper criteria? Do you have any insight as to, if that's even possible, or how an organization can go about doing that if they wanted to pursue that?
That really is a best practice, but depending on the scale of an organization and the volume of devices that might be BYOD devices, it might be not practical to do that. So that's unfortunately where the policies come into play, that if you have some type of checklist besides the policy that could be leveraged and used, and then offer that type of support to end users, so that if they do have questions or want to go through a remote session to verify some type of settings, then that becomes a method for accomplishing that. But as far as actually doing something proactively, it may not be practical in a very large environment, but it is recommended.
Sure. And we've had clients, just to add some color to that as well, we've had clients contact us about, potentially consolidating, endpoint antivirus and host intrusion detection licenses, and moving some of those to, BYOD or personal devices, or if a corporate device does not have it on it yet, to deploying those to end users that will be remote or working remotely more, considering the times that we're in. So, there are companies that are taking that proactive action, which is very important.
Yeah, and I'd like to add in something to it, along with automating the process and trying to remove some of the burden. You're not going to be able to do everything we're talking about here, but you can implement some network access controls to provide some assurance that people are meeting some of the minimums, that they have antivirus, that it's up to date, they have up-to-date patches and things like that, either using some of the network access controls when they connect into the corporate network, or using software like a mobile device management software to look at cell phones and tablets and laptops and things that are managed through the software, to ensure that they have a password of sufficient characters and complexity, and the software, some of the software configuration settings that would meet some of those best practices. It doesn't extend as far as a full audit, but this can give you some level of automation and some assurance that those devices that are connecting in to the network have those settings on them, or it will reject them, or give them the resources to remediate those issues before connecting in.
Yeah, that's a good point, Eric. I mean, part of what would be very recommended is that if there are things that are easily implemented or within the control of the IT support or the MSP to do those things, like implementing password refreshes, or like you mentioned, increasing the complexity requirements for a password. Those are things that are best practices under any circumstances, but certainly now. And then another thing we didn't necessarily touch on, but there's a term called user behavior analytics. This is if you have those type of capabilities within your current tools within the organization, this would be a time to pay extremely more attention to that, so that if there are unusual usage patterns beginning to occur, that's something that is highlighted, and there's an opportunity to investigate that as well. If you're not familiar with those types of tools, it's something that could be implemented, but it's definitely, if you have that, this would be the time to pay even more attention to those dashboards and the information that comes out of those as well.
Sure. So we have another heavy hitter question here potentially, and maybe Frank or Eric, maybe you guys can ping pong this one a little bit. But in light of what's going on, the question was, if employees must work from home on personal devices instead of company issue devices, are there any additional steps that should be taken? And maybe we can take this from the perspective of from the employer, and then from the perspective of the employee. I know we may have touched on some of this already, but just to maybe cover some additional things that can be taken from both perspectives. Frank or Eric?
Eric, go ahead if you'd like to start.
Yes. Well, you have a number of different options here. One might be to implement virtual desktops within the company, and then the personal devices could be used simply to initiate those connections back to a virtual desktop, and that retains the the data, the applications, and the data flow still within the supported organizational systems. Now, that may not be practical for everyone, and so if you have to use those personal devices and they're going to be performing the work actually on that device, you may be able to roll out that centralized endpoint management software. This could be through your antivirus tool to allow you to enforce some controls. And the big thing I'm thinking of here is some of the data loss prevention, so that you can enforce some of your data policies. They say, hey, this data, you're downloading it to the device, and you can only use it in this way. Like, you can't upload it to these cloud services, and you can't email it out. You can only put it to this data repository that is the supported one, and things like that, to allow you to have a little bit more granular control over the data and its flow. And that's the part I'm really pushing on here. But also, you want to ensure that the machines have a certain level of security controls on them as well. And so you want to push out the policies for ensuring that their antivirus is up to date, and then educate those users on the importance of things like patch management and safe browsing, detecting phishing messages, and keeping the machine up to date.
Yeah, and that was part of what I was going to add as well, is it might not be possible to go and do a direct audit of all those devices as users have those requirements, but it could be an opportunity, even either on an individual or group basis, to do some session on refreshing the walkthrough of the policy, or even walking through with those users at the same time in a group setting to validate some of those things that are mentioned. So there's different, again, creative means to achieve the ultimate goal, but you have to look at what might be practical based on the volume that might be hitting the IT support team.
Sure. Yeah, and the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about that and using personal devices is some things we've seen in some of our incident response cases, and that's when a personal device will have, may have been used for, business work or for company work. However, many people don't realize that in Windows 10, when you're initially setting up your laptop or your computer and it's personal, sometimes Windows will, or Microsoft, will take the extra steps for you and create a Microsoft Online account for you and begin uploading your documents, your downloads, and a lot of your other personal files that you downloaded to your machine to a OneDrive account. So now that data is in the cloud. And from Microsoft's perspective, they're doing that so you can have a seamless experience through, through all of your devices that run Windows and run that single account. However, there are some considerations to think about there, and what Eric brought up with the data loss protection, that would prevent some of that happening, and potentially prevent some further issues regarding that. Overall, I think the consensus here is that make sure your routers are updated, make sure you're updating your computers and restarting them on a regular basis, make sure your phones are updated, and make sure that any IoT devices are updated as well. And there's also the recommendation of running a separate wireless network, or have a completely separate network at home. Many routers have the capability of doing this. That way you can segregate, your internet traffic.
So I know, Bogdan, you just mentioned data loss protection. That's another item going back to the discussions around file sharing. That's something that if your organization has not implemented that's another method for preventing information, or certainly critical information, from going out through email. So if you have to refresh or re-verify the policy, or whether that's implemented, this would be a time to do that. And that's something that can be done at a corporate level, without having to touch every user, or certainly has to be communicated to users, but something that could be implemented fairly easily as well.
Yes. So let's wrap up with this last question here. What are the risks of sharing computer viruses as organizations begin joining more communication services, such as Slack or Microsoft Teams?
Well, I think there's a high probability that could occur. There's no question that if those files, or whether those files are exchanged by email, internal or external, or on some type of collaboration space, that can occur. So that's where having the antivirus on that actual device, if there's some ability through your email solution to scan the emails for attachments, and if they have any type of viruses, make sure that that's enabled. But ultimately, everyone has to be that much more diligent and suspect of where those files originated from, and to make sure that there's a method for identifying whether that exists on that file or not.
Yeah, and I'll hop in here real quick. Like I mentioned earlier, in this presentation, is that we've seen trusted infrastructure like Microsoft Office 365, OneNote being used to bypass, and circumvent spam filters and antivirus filters, because Microsoft is going to whitelist their own infrastructure within a lot of the technologies out there that are designed to block malware and malicious links. So again, goes back to what Frank was saying: be diligent, be vigilant, and take caution when opening attachments and clicking on links.
Yeah, you never know if another user on your team platform there, it could be compromised, and so those links that they send out have to be treated with the same level of skepticism that you would treat an email.
Right, exactly.
Well, I think that's about all the time we have. Thank you, Bogdan. Thank you, Frank. And thank you to everyone who's attended our webcast today.
Thanks for having us.
Yep, thank you. Ditto.